members, we got a lab practical tomorrow, so don't forget about that. I imagine that's unlikely. Also, as announced in lecture last time, we're bumping the lecture exam back to Wednesday, the 27th, and then on the 26th, do go to your lab as normally scheduled, although we won't be using the full 3-hour period. So we're going to use the first 50 to 55 minutes or so to cover lecture to stay on pace. And then for those of you who are interested and would like to take a look at some of the snakes in my lab, we'll do that after we cover a little bit of lecture material. So make sure you keep track of those changes. Take-home assignment number 5 will be due on Friday, the 22nd, as indicated in the syllabus. But then take-home 6 is a take-home portion of the lecture exam. So that will be due at the beginning of the lecture exam on Wednesday. So I hope everybody's clear about that. And for those of you who need to take the tests in different locations, as before, please come to me with an envelope at the beginning of the exam time on Wednesday, and then we'll get that sealed and you can take that over to the tests. Okay? Well, perhaps you've all recently had lunch, so maybe food is on your brain. Obviously, acquiring food is important for all animals, because of course they're heterotrophs, and reptiles are no exception to that. So we're going to cover feeding of reptiles these next couple of lectures and some of the associated tasks. The tongue has important functions, but those functions do differ depending on the particular group of reptiles of interest. Not too surprisingly at this stage of the game, a lot of this structural variation falls out in an overall pattern that makes sense in light of the evolutionary relationships among different clades of extant reptiles. And tongues can protrude out beyond the tips of the jaws in practically all species of reptiles. But interestingly, some of the details of how that's done differ depending on the group of reptiles. And we're again going to take some rather broad brush strokes for different groups of reptiles, for what they eat and how they eat. So another thing you should always keep in mind for all of this stuff is don't just learn this in isolation for one group, but get used to comparing and contrasting what happens in one group compared to another. And don't limit those comparisons as you're organizing your thoughts just to reptiles. Also think about how reptiles resemble or differ from some of the examples we've had for amphibians. And ultimately keep in mind for how things work in fishes too. Okay? So, what are some of the things that tongues do? A very general function of the tongue in reptiles is to move food around in the oral cavity and to facilitate swallowing. And the fancy word for that is deglutition. Okay? Another thing that tongues of reptiles do, but again, this depends on the particular group of reptiles, is to actually aid in capturing prey. And yet another thing that tongues do in reptiles, especially squamate reptiles, is they're important sensory structures. And the tongues will be stuck out of the mouth in order to pick up odor particles. And then there are chemosensors that actually reside on the tongue, or in most cases, actually, the tongue just transports odor particles into the mouth, and then there's an organ in the roof of the mouth that actually has the chemosensors. Okay? Well, if we think of major groups and these different functions, in turtles, most of the action involved in the tongue is intraoral transport and deglutition. And this is certainly most pronounced in turtles that are more terrestrial than in aquatic turtles. Okay? It stands to reason that, based on everything you know about eating in water, one of the options that aquatic turtles have is to actually move water to move food in the mouth. Whereas when you're up on land and in air, obviously that's not an option. So you would expect intuitively, I would hope, that difference between terrestrial and aquatic species. Okay? It's always fun to look at some of the very specialized departures from these more generalized conditions. And a lot of you are probably familiar with the alligator snapping turtle. This is the largest freshwater turtle in North America, so it's pretty popular in zoos. And this derived function of lingual learning is really quite striking. That involves both anatomical specializations and some specialized behaviors, as we'll see in this video clip. Okay, so you can see the mouth is being held open, and in the floor of the mouth, you see this very slender little structure that gets wiggled around. Okay? And it may not look like much to us, but if you're a fish, it tends to capture your fancy. And these turtles are bottom-dwelling turtles. And notice it's a lot easier if you have the fish swim into the mouth than have to worry about chasing a fish around. And notice how quickly that occurs. And this is a case where pretty much just the jaws are slammed shut. Okay. Now, you've got some additional materials regarding how the common snapping turtles feed. And there's some variation in aquatic turtles for how important suction is or is not. There's some very specialized aquatic turtles like the Madagascar where suction is very important. And then there's some species where it helps out, but there are other movements that occur as well. Okay? Here's just a close-up of what the tongue of an alligator snapper looks like. Again, depending on the particular individual and so on, the color can vary, but it has sort of this worm-like shape, and that shape combined with the movement is very effective for luring fish into the mouth of the turtle. What reptiles are lepidosaurs?
Snakes, lizards.
Snakes and lizards. Anybody else? Any other reptiles? I mean,
Isn't the tuatara?
the tuatara. So let's deal with higher order taxa. What orders of extant reptiles make up the lepidosaurs? Cynodontia and squamata. Okay, and then squamates includes lizards and snakes and skinks. Well, skinks are a type of lizard, so that's true. But what's missing? Right, don't forget about our little friends, the Anthus. Okay? So, it's a huge group. And in the Tuatara, it would appear that the tongue is mainly used for intraoral transport. And then within lizards, there is a group of lizards, a very diverse group of lizards, known as the Iguana. And lizard taxonomy, like so many other aspects of vertebrate taxonomy, it keeps wiggling around. So this term has fallen in and out of favor as time goes on. Okay. But within the Iguana, at least, we see a very important role for capturing prey. Okay? And in squamate reptiles, so this is obviously more inclusive than just the iguanian lizards, we see a very important, but not absolutely universal role for a sensory function. Namely, the tongue is protruded in order to pick up odor particles. And doing that sampling, if you will, of the environment by sticking the tongue out, bringing it back into the mouth, is referred to as chemosensory protrusion. I mean, why use simple words when you can say sticking the tongue out of the mouth, when you can come up with a fancy one like that. Okay? Now, what is interesting is, again, we don't have all of these functions being equally important in all different groups. But in snakes and some lizards, the tongue is used for very little other than chemosensory protrusion. Okay? So one of the things that's interesting to ponder, and we'll get into those details momentarily, is do we have an example of some sort of trade-off in design where if you have a tongue that's really good for this chemosensory protrusion, is it perhaps not so good for doing these other things? Okay? And on your handout 16, you've got some illustrations of different tongues. And one common morphology is that the tip of the tongue is undivided. And there certainly are lots of amniotes other than lepidostauros, including us. So the generalized ancestral condition is probably an undivided tip in amniotes, which we think is the ancestral condition. And that rather presumably old and generalized morphology is retained in Sphenodon, the Tuatara. Okay? But then there are some departures to this sort of nondescript, rather fleshy, thick tongue with an undivided tip. In some groups, the tip can move rather freely and is rather thin and flat and quite protrusible. And oddly enough, that allows some very unusual behaviors that would not otherwise be possible. And this is not a super common thing, although it's reasonably common within geckos. Here's a big Madagascar Day Gecko, very popular in the pet trade. These are very nicely colored critters, very docile. Okay, and there you can see, oddly enough, in this group without eyelids, which is not super common for lizards. But basically, they've got a windshield washer for a tongue. Okay? Obviously, that is a departure from the more generalized condition. Okay? And here is just an illustration of a gecko tongue from the handout 16. Okay? Well, what's this? That's an Amphis medium, okay? And what's coming out of its mouth? And the shape of the tongue is forked. Okay, so I think almost all of you are aware that snakes have forked tongues, but actually forked tongues are reasonably common in squamings, and not even just limited to lizards. Okay? So there are many groups that have moderately to deeply forked tips of their tongues, including amphibians, including teid lizards, one shown over here to the right. Teid lizards are a primarily New World group, whereas the lacertive lizards, many of them look uncannily similar to the teid lizards, but they're mainly an Old World group. And then a rather large group of lizards known as the anglomorph lizards. And then, of course, the snakes. Okay? Now, here's an example of a lizard that belongs to what family? The Varanidae, also known as the monitor lizards. That happens to be a Komodo dragon. That's the largest extant lizard in the world. And in addition to having a tongue that you can see is quite long and skinny and deeply forked, that tongue can be withdrawn into a lingual sheath. The varanid lizards have a lingual sheath, as do snakes. Now, historically, this had been one of the anatomical traits that biologists had used to assume that, well, maybe snakes and monitor lizards are closely related. But there's been a lot of back and forth for exactly the extent to which that's the case. You've got a phylogeny of the Lepidosauria on your handout. I believe that's handout 14, is it not? Okay, so taxonomists and evolutionary biologists keep shaking up how things are arranged. For quite a long time, this was a pretty widely accepted phylogeny of the Lepidosauria, okay? Where we've got two atars here, and then we've got all this stuff of the Squaming Reptiles. Monitor lizards over here, snakes here, and amphibians here. But we've got this big old chunk of diversity that includes the iguanid lizards in the New World and the agamid lizards in the Old World, and their sister group, the chameleons, the Old World chameleons. And note the anglomorphs are the anguids, the Gila monster and beaded lizard, and the monitor lizards. Well, that's fallen out of favor largely as a result of molecular data winning the day for what's currently accepted phylogeny. So what you have on your handout is really substantially different than that. Because notice that this group Iguana is nested well within other taxa. So rather than being a presumably basal lineage, it's well nested within this crown group that includes all extant groups of lizards, snakes, and everything else. Now, when this was the accepted phylogeny, there was a rather tidy story to be told regarding the shape of tongues, chemosensory tongue protrusion, and the like, because you've got a whole bunch of critters up here that rely extensively on chemosensory protrusion, and they have deeply divided tongues. And then you've got a whole bunch of critters here with undivided tongues. Well, in science, when the information comes to light, you have to change things so you have a logically consistent framework. So historically, there was a lot of emphasis on, gosh, the iguanas are a good model of what was probably the ancestral condition for squaming reptiles. But if you look at their currently accepted location, you can see that they're no longer positioned such that one would expect them to be a good model for what was a likely ancestral condition in squamings. So it's easy to find some literature from just about maybe 10 or 20 years ago where the explanations for the diversity of form and function of squamate tongues has interpretations that don't hold up in light of present day accepted phylogenies. Yet another recent development, and there's been a lot of ink spilt back and forth about this, is whether to consider this a clade for which the most recent common ancestor actually had at least some rudimentary sort of venom. We'll talk about venom much more next time when we talk about some of the specialized morphologies that snakes have. So realize this is a current working framework. It's not written in stone. It may change. It certainly has changed radically in the space of a modest number of years. So you always need to keep that in mind when you're looking at these different resources and reading about interpretations, especially in light of how things have evolved. Okay? Oh, that's just an example of the lingual sheet for a monitor. Okay? Well, it's kind of interesting that there is this derived function for a tongue that at various times has even been suggested as being a synaptomorphy for squamate. Now, one thing that's held up in all these phylogenies is that the order Squamata is monophyletic. So that has never been a problem. There's never been any attempt to combine Tuatara with squamate. Okay? And this is probably what most of you think of when you think of a reptile sticking its tongue out and sampling the environment. And once again, what the tongue is doing is picking up odor particles, not actually analyzing those odor particles. So there's an organ, the Jacobson's organ, in the roof of the mouth that those odor particles are transferred to, and that actually has the chemosensors. Okay? Well, arguably, these critters are quite adept at sticking their tongues out and withdrawing their tongues back into the mouth. Let's consider actually how that happens. And I think it's pretty neat for how it happens, because as it turns out, the best model of how this occurs, especially for snakes and some of these lizards with more elongated tongues, is that you have something that is functioning as a muscular hydrostat. Now, most of you are probably used to the muscles of vertebrates causing actions by moving bones, whereas there are a variety of soft-bodied invertebrates that can still move and change shape, but they do so commonly by using muscular hydrostats. So this is something that's not super common in vertebrates and is worth considering in a bit more detail. Okay? So what's some of the infrastructure within the tongue that's involved in this? Well, in the outermost layer of the tongue, which can be thought of as a rather long, skinny cylinder, in these species that readily stick their tongues out, the fibers go around the circumference of that cylindrical-like structure. Can you think of another example we've covered where there are fibers that wrap around the circumference of a long, skinny structure?
Was it the turtle penis? Or was it the paracalypenes?
In the hemipenes, there are fibers that are oriented circumferentially. Absolutely, that's one example. I'm thinking of another example in the head end of critters.
No torches?
No. The fiber is oriented this way, squeezing on a long, skinny thing. Take salamanders. In salamander feeding,
Is it like the hyoid arch of a salamander?
what kind of salamander? That have hyolingual protrusion, a really long way.
This is the Plethodontidae.
The plethodontic salamanders, okay? They have that muscle that wraps around the epibranchial and basically squirts it out, okay? So circumferential muscles, when they contract, are going to have forces oriented this way. That causes pressure, right, inside of that structure. Now, interestingly, the tongues of snakes do not have, when they're extended, a skeletal element. The tongues are basically all squishy stuff and mostly muscle. Perhaps it's not too surprising that some muscles oriented along the long axis of the animal retract the tongue. And also think back to the plethodontid salamanders and the rectus abdominis muscle, which retracts the tongue in a fairly straightforward fashion because the fibers are oriented from head to tail. And if they shorten, that's going to bring the tongue back into the mouth. But if we don't have any bones that these muscles are acting upon, how the heck do you get movement when you've got all this squishy stuff? Well, even though this stuff is squishy, it has a constant volume because you've got all of these proteins and liquids and so on that have a constant volume, but they're squishy. So the shape can and does change, okay? And when you have something that's long and thin, you get a bigger bang for your buck for how much it lengthens for a given change in the diameter of the cylinder. So let's consider this in a little more detail. Okay. So here is a cylindrical structure. And of course, cylinders have a certain length, L, and are characterized by a certain diameter, D. Okay? And the volume of a cylinder, V, is just equal to pi divided by 4 times L times D squared. Okay? And you can rearrange that equation to express length equal to 4b over pi and b to the minus, wrong equation. So that would be minus 2, okay? So if we have a constant volume, V, all this stuff is just a numerical constant. So we've got the numerical constant times D to the minus 2. So we can make a plot of L versus D. And what's really, really important to remember is this is for a constant volume. We're going to get a curve. And that curve is a negative quadratic function, so that's going to look something like this. Okay? So now let's consider how those circumferential muscles decrease the diameter and what are the consequences for changing the length. Think if you had a water balloon and you put your hands around the water balloon and went like this, water's got to go someplace, so the ends would squish out and it would get longer as you compress that cylinder filled with fluid, okay? So let's just say this is our starting point for picking a particular diameter. And then if we go from diameter 1 to diameter 2, okay, we get a given change, okay? Now, if we do that same thing over here, where we have the same change in diameter, but a different starting diameter, we're going to mark off equal amounts along the x-axis. And notice there's barely a difference. So here we've got a change in length from 1 to 2, and here we've got a change in length from 3 to 4, let's say. Okay? So what's really interesting is there's actually a very simple explanation then for why these tongues that are highly protrusible are long and skinny. They're functioning as muscular hydrostats. And the punchline of this very simple geometry is that if you have a smaller diameter for a given change in diameter, you get a much greater change in length. Now, of course, if both of those changes in diameter happen over the same time, units of velocity are just distance divided by time, then a long skinny cylinder would be faster than a short fat one for a given change in diameter. Okay? So actually, there are a number of things out there that function as muscular hydrostats. Perhaps some of the better known examples to you might be the tentacles of squid that shoot out and capture things. They're functioning in a similar way. But here it's pretty neat that actually within the body of a vertebrate, we've got a very important system that is using something that is more commonly found in soft-bodied invertebrates. Okay? You need not worry about the math, but certainly remember what this graph looks like and the consequences. Namely, long, skinny tongues are better for sticking in and out of the mouth long distances and doing so faster. That's sort of the punchline of that. And if you look at the tongues of snakes compared to many lizard taxa, they're very slender indeed. Okay? Once again, we're always trying to relate how structure is related to function. So there are a lot of very direct consequences. Okay? Well, what are some of the things that reptiles eat? Again, I'm going to be painting with very, very broad brush strokes here. The vast majority of reptiles are actually carnivores, and the majority of turtles are mostly carnivorous. You're probably aware of some departures from this in turtles, especially a number of the land tortoises are either omnivores or as adults may be strict herbivores. Locally, we have box turtles, and box turtles actually eat all kinds of stuff, okay, both plant and animal. Those big Galapagos tortoises are herbivores, okay. But again, those tend to be, if you just look at the fraction of turtles that do that, that's a rather modest number of turtles for which that's the case, okay? And crocodilians are strict carnivores, okay? And you're probably aware that crocodilians are very formidable predators. They're often at the top of the rung in the ecosystems in which they occur. And they often take on some very sizable prey. And their teeth are actually not very well suited for taking bites out of prey. So you wouldn't necessarily think they would take chunks out of prey based on their anatomy. However, they have a specialized behavior that allows them to take chunks out of prey. And you may be familiar with the so-called rolling behavior or death roll that is widespread in crocodilian species. No, it's not a crocodilian yet.
To a croc this big, anything that ventures near a watering hole is a potential meal. Crocodiles can't easily chase down prey. They are ambush hunters that prefer their prey to come to them.
Not a good place to go swimming.
It's feast or famine for the crocodiles, so they gorge when food is plentiful. And the biggest meal of the year is about to arrive. Searching for water and green grass, millions of zebras, wildebeests, and antelopes join one of the largest mass migrations on the planet. Rivers are one of the few reliable sources of water, but they're also home to crocodiles. The herd gathers at the river's edge. They're suspicious, and the crocs don't want to scare them off. So the crocs lay low, hoping to lure as many into the river as possible.
Oddly enough, they're cutting back and forth between water buffalo and wildebeest.
The croc can stay underwater for up to 2 hours at a time. It works its way to the edge, waiting for the right moment. Inches from a kill, but it misses. Spooking the first row of animals. However, there are hundreds of thousands more that need to cross.
So this is
The
a
croc
seasonal
just has to
migration.
retreat and bide his
It
time.
has this crossing point on the river. Okay. And oops.
I
Well, I thought that
told
shows the death toll in there. I apologize for that. That's a slightly different clip than I thought that I had. But at any rate, you saw how large those wildebeest are. After they capture them, they commonly drag them underwater. So some combination of the traumatic injuries and drowning are usually the cause of death. And then they spin around and will take large chunks of the prey out that they can sort of bolt down. Okay? So obviously, if a predator can take a piece out of prey, then it can attack and exploit prey larger than can be swallowed whole, and sometimes even larger than the predator. Is there a question?
Yeah, do you think they ever get trampled though? Because it looked like this got stampeded by the wildebeest.
Oh, that the crocs get trampled? I suspect that the way the water would sort of blunt the forces from the hooves coming down, that's not much of a problem. The other thing is they're just darn tough critters. There are a whole bunch of osteoderms in the back. So if you've ever touched the back of a crocodile, most of you haven't touched that, but at any rate, it's almost like they're just armor plated. Okay. So I think that's rather unlikely. So sadly, it's the wildebeest that are coming out second. It's no revenge of the wildebeest by stomping on the crocs. Okay. Oh, I should mention that tuataras eat a wide variety of animal material, insects, bird eggs, a variety of vertebrates, and so on. So they're also carnivore. Next, let's consider squaming reptiles, starting with lizards, and again, painting with rather broad brush strokes. The vast majority of lizards eat insects. So now we're kind of looking at a radically different strategy than crocodilians, where to get a big meal, they have to eat a lot of tiny things, and necessarily that means that they have to be rather active. That's not a lizard, I hope you all realize. That's not a reptile, but that belongs to what class? Yes. Here we go.
Here, the numbers.
This is in Africa, and these are agamid lizards, and that is a type of Iguanian lizard.
These crevices in South Africa contain the highest density of lizards in the world. They're called flat lizards for obvious reasons. They float their multicolored bellies in territorial
A
disputes.
good example of sexual dimorphism, the males have these brightly colored signs.
And now it's time to find some food. As the day warms up, the lizards move away from their tracks and head down to the bottom of the gorge. Their goal is the river. There is no food at the edge, but this desert river holds a secret. Each day, blackfly rise from turbulent stretches of the river. This is what lizards are comfortable. Blackfly never land, so the lizards have to leave for their food.
The remarkable agility required to exploit this resource. Of course, each prey item is tiny.
In one day, each of these acrobatic little lizards may catch 50 flies.
So there you have sort of the two extremes of exploiting very large prey, feeding rather infrequently. But the vast majority of lizards are exploiting very modest-sized prey, feeding quite frequently, so many of them are actively foraging rather than just kind of sitting around and waiting for prey to come to them. Okay? So that's a very important generalization regarding the size of the prey relative to the size of the lizards. Again, there are some interesting departures, some of which you may be familiar with. There are some herbivorous lizards. It's not uncommon in herbivorous lizards for the juveniles to actually be omnivores or even carnivores and then transition to become strict herbivores as an adult. So a common example of that are common iguanas. You realize those have often been very common pets. In the southwest U.S., there's a desert iguana in the genus Dipsosaurus. It's a strict herbivore as an adult. And as far as feeding on stuff within lizards, when you have something big in the mouth, you have to have a really big tongue to move something big around. So with some of these bigger food items, whether it's plant material or animal material, you commonly see a movement referred to as inertial transport. And unfortunately, my favorite video of this is no longer available on the web. But think of something, everything has inertia, so it will simply stay at rest unless acted upon by some force. So think of a big heavy thing here, and a lizard that is biting it like this, okay? If the lizard quickly moves its head back, then that imparts some momentum to the food object. And then if it's released with the jaws, that's going to keep on going. So if you cruise the web looking for some videos of, say, maybe a monitor lizard bolting down a huge chunk of food, or for that matter, an iguana eating a great big chunk of a plant, that's a common method for transporting larger stuff in the mouth in preparation for swallowing. And you can even see that inertial transport in many of the food items consumed by crocodilians as well. Okay? Now, of course, snakes are another large group of squaming reptiles. Snakes are strictly carnivorous. It's not like we have any interesting departures within snakes. Another key feature of snakes is they're specialized for swallowing very large prey that are intact. Now, obviously, if you have this strategy, you're going to have some anatomical limit based on how big the mouth opening is for how large a prey resource can be exploited. So that sets up some very different constraints on feeding than these animals that can take bites out of the prey. In addition to always consuming other animals, an awful lot of the prey consumed by snakes are actually vertebrates. Most commonly, if snakes consume invertebrates, they're soft-bodied invertebrates, such as slugs, earthworms, sometimes even leeches. A super rare prey source for snakes to exploit are arthropods. Of course, arthropods have hard external skeletons. Arthropods, such as crustaceans, have these formidable claws and spines, and in fact, that's asking quite a lot in order to eat something that is so formidable. Okay? Well, depending on how your teeth are shaped, that's also going to have some consequences for what you're able to do. Again, painting with very broad brush strokes. Within reptiles, in contrast to mammals, within a single species and within a given individual, you usually don't see much variation in the shapes of the teeth. Although you may see some reasonable variation in the sizes of the teeth. So a lot of the teeth are rather conically shaped, as in alligators, or somewhat blade-like, as in the iguana. Obviously, something like this is a little better for cutting. Perhaps this reminds you of a gar, and the sharp teeth of a gar for grabbing onto fish. But in a nutshell, if you have all these different tooth shapes, you don't have teeth that are well suited for grinding, and you're well aware that when you ate your lunch today, you do a lot of grinding and processing of the food in your mouth before you actually swallow. And in snakes in particular, the teeth are very long and skinny, and they're very good for capturing prey, but they're not good for doing things such as taking bites. Okay? Another noteworthy feature of the teeth of extant reptiles is that unlike our teeth, they're replaced throughout the lifetime of the individual. So the teeth commonly get damaged, broken off, and so on. It's not that big of a deal. Another one comes in and replaces it. Okay? Now, if we think of, again, of some of what's in the head of squaming reptiles, the skull ancestrally has an interesting feature. Between the frontal and the parietal bones, you have nearly a straight line where these bones abut, and because of the way the ligaments are arranged, the foot not too elegantly, the nose can basically wiggle relative to the brain case. So this is referred to as a kinetic skull. And next time when we cover feeding of snakes, we're going to discover a remarkable ability to move the different bones of the skull during feeding. Okay? Just a couple of quick videos of lizard feeding, where the tongue is actually important for Iguanian lizards.
Good energy. We have some book.
And here is an agamid lizard in very slow motion. Here's a cricket. So this is slowed down by a factor of about 20. And notice it doesn't stick out too much, but the tongue does protrude beyond the tips of the jaws. So it's actually the tongue that makes first contact, not the jaws. So the tongue is involved in prey capture as a very important role nearly throughout all Iguanian lizards. And then, of course, the tongues get thrown into the mouth. A little bit of munching occurs, but not nearly as much of reduction of food as occurs in mammals. Now, very specialized feeding apparatus is found in the old world chameleons. Again, this is slowed down tremendously. And hopefully this makes you think back to the plecodontic salamanders. Okay, notice that tremendous distance that occurs for the tongue sticking out of the mouth and then being withdrawn. And then another uncanny resemblance to the plecodontic salamanders. Here are two side-by-side videos at two different temperatures, and just as in plecodontic salamanders, tongue projection is nearly independent of temperature. That implies there's some sort of elastic storage mechanism that helps propel the tongue. Whereas then you look at the speed of retraction, and the lizard at the warmer temperature can actually retract the tongue faster. You've got a lot of the details regarding the muscles that are involved in chameleon feeding on your handout, and I will not be asking you those details on the in-class lecture exam, but on some potential take-home questions, that material may be for you. Okay? So we'll see you next time, and we'll concentrate on take-home.